Everyone, meet Pete. Peat Marsh. In 1984, his remains were discovered in a peat bog in Cheshire, and he's the most well-preserved bog body in Britain. But who was he? And how did he end up dead and preserved in a peat bog in northwest England? So let's start with how he was discovered, and then we'll take a look at what anthropologists and researchers have found and what likely happened to him. And also, real quick, a huge shout out to my newest Cannibal patron member, Yolanda. I'll give you a proper shout out in my next full-length podcast episode, but it'll be a while before that comes out. So I just wanted to say now that I appreciate you and your support. Now, Pete over here is called the Lindow Man, but he's got his fun nickname because of where he was found, the Lindow Moss peat bog. Do you get it? Peat? Marsh? Get it? I apologize for nothing. Now, peat, the substance, not the man, is decayed plant matter that's formed over thousands of years in wetlands, and it's used in soils, it's a good filtration medium, and can be burned as a source of fuel. And because peat bogs have a low oxygen content and are acidic and have lower than average temperatures, they're excellent for preventing decay and mummifying soft tissues. To date, we've discovered hundreds of bog bodies throughout northern Europe. And on the day Peat Marsh was found, a commercial peat cutter was sorting junk from peat on a conveyor belt. And he saw what looked like a piece of wood, so he took it off the belt and just kind of chucked it off to the side. Though I also read a source that says he threw it at his coworker. But as the clump hit the ground, a human bone was dislodged, and archaeologists were called in. And soon after, archaeologist Rick Turner was brought to the site where that particular load of peat was from. And, in his own words, quote, "Walking the uncut sections, I found a flap of dark, tanned skin projecting from below." Only given a day to excavate, Turner facilitated lifting the entire block of peat where Peat Marsh was so that they could take their time examining his body later. And it ended up being a 2x3 meter or roughly 6x9 foot block. And from there, Pete was brought to Macclesfield District General Hospital for storage. And then the landowners of the peat bog ended up donating Pete to the British Museum, and he arrived there on August 21st. And he's still there today. And since he was the second of several bog bodies found in this particular peat bog, he is officially known as Lindow II. The first find was done with the Lindow woman, but what is so unique about the Lindow man, Lindow II, Peat Marsh, is the state of his body and the manner of his death. So here's what we know. He was in his mid to late 20s. He was about 1.68 meters tall, or like 5'6". He weighed roughly 60 to 65 kilos, which is 132, 143-ish pounds, and was in good shape. And interestingly, it didn't look like he had done much hard labor. His nails were nicely manicured, his mustache and beard was neatly trimmed, his teeth were in really good shape as well. But apart from an armband made of fox fur, he was completely naked and dumped face first into the bog. So what happened to this man? I like how the Science History Institute puts it in an article, quote, "Put a mystery in front of any 5 scientists and you'll end up with a lot of arguing and a dozen theories, but probably few concrete answers. For Lindow Man, that extends to how he died." End quote. And doesn't that just perfectly sum up history and archaeology? But here's what they found. They found a couple of blows to the head with a blunt V-shaped object that left a 3.5 centimeter or 1.4 inch cut in the top of his skull, and this was confirmed with a zero radiography scan. They found a sliver of skull in his brain from the aforementioned V-shaped object. They found a laceration on the back of his skull, a blow across his back made by a blunt object, a broken neck, and at least one broken rib bone, ligature marks on his neck, his throat was cut from ear to ear, and a possible stab wound in the upper right chest. So, regardless of how he died and what happened to this man, I think we can all agree at the very least that the manner of his death was really violent. He didn't just trip and fall and drown in a peat bog naturally. The argument is deciding which of those things caused his death, which were done posthumously, and potentially what wasn't done at all by man. Could centuries of preservation in the peat bog have broken up his body as things moved around? Well, there are a few things from the list that stand out, at least to me, and many point to those ligature marks on his neck as the potential cause of death by strangulation. Was Pete Marsh strangled to death with a garrote? Possibly, but some think perhaps he was wearing a necklace and was maybe used to strangle him a bit. Some also think that maybe he was garroted to drain the blood faster from his cut throat. Robert Connolly, a physical anthropologist, believes that the ligature marks might have been caused by swelling and bloating from being submerged in the peat bog. Possibly. So, what about the blow to the head then? Does that have less, potentials to it? Many assume that the V-shaped mark on his head came from a blunt axe, which would certainly make sense for the time. But was this done before or after his death? One way to tell that would be brain swelling. If there was evidence of swelling, the damage was done while he was still alive. If there was no swelling, it was done after his death. And they did find swelling along the edge of the wound, so he was alive as he received an axe to the head. Ouch. So then, which was likely the cause of death? Well, it's impossible to know for sure, right? But many believe that the blow to the head knocked him out, and then he was strangled and then placed face down in the bog, so kind of like a combination of things. But why was he killed? Of course, we don't know that for certain either, so it's always just speculation, but there have been several theories over the years, and some of them make some sense. Shortly after his discovery, the BBC put out a program in 1985 called The Body in the Bog, and it was pretty popular. It attracted 10 million viewers, and not only did it follow the scientists examining the body, but it put forth an idea about why he died. Ritual sacrifice. The argument stemmed from the sheer overkill of his death. Anne Ross, an Iron Age religion expert, believed that the cut throat, the strangulation, and the blow to the head was an offering to different gods, something known as a triple kill, or triple death, which is rooted in various European folklores. Ronald Hutton, a historian of early Britain, British folklore, and pre-Christian religions, disagrees. He argues that since it's possible Pete Marsh died after Roman invasion, and therefore after human sacrifice was outlawed, that it might not be a religious death at all. Maybe he was killed as a form of punishment. We know that the Roman general Tacitus wrote about how the Germanic tribes would kill and punish, so maybe that's true of the Britons. Quote, "The coward, the shirker, and the disreputable body are drowned in miry swamps under a cover of wattled hurdles." End quote. So, again, could that Roman source also apply to the Lindow Man and the early Britons? Maybe, but like I noted in my Wicker Man full podcast episode, we can't really trust the Roman sources about their enemies to be unbiased. I mean, Caesar wrote that the Gauls constructed man-shaped effigies out of wicker, stuffed men into the limbs, and set them on fire, which is nonsensical and has never been corroborated. Now others, like Robert Connolly, argue that perhaps he was just a victim of violent robbery, noting that, quote, "Whether he was fighting naked or his clothes have degraded without trace is open to question. If, as is suggested by his hair, nails, and bodily habitus, he was more than a simple peasant, then perhaps his clothes were worth taking either by his assailant or by some other person or persons unknown. But absence of preserved clothes does not confirm ritual." End quote. Fair enough. But this argument was first made in 1985 in Anthropology Today. More recent studies, including the knowledge that he was rendered unconscious by the blow to the back of the head before having his throat potentially garroted and then definitely slit open, kind of negates that argument a little bit. This wasn't a quick robbery and murder. Those responsible for Pete Marsh's death took their time. Jody Joy, who is the senior curator at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of Cambridge, also disagrees with the murder-robbery argument, noting that, quote, "The jury really is still out on these bog bodies, whether they were aristocrats, priests, criminals, outsiders, whether they went willingly to their deaths or whether they were executed, but Lindow was a very remote place in those days, an unlikely place for an ambush or a murder. End quote. But there might be some credence to the religious sacrifice argument, because Anne Ross found that there were the undigested remains of a partially burnt barley cake in his stomach. I mentioned this in my episode on the Wicker Man. A portion of a barley cake would be burnt, the thing is ripped into pieces and thrown into a bag, and whoever draws out the burnt cake piece is the sacrifice. Anne Ross theorized that perhaps the Lindow Man was a druid who was sacrificed to stop a Roman advance on the Celts in 60 CE. It definitely falls within the window of his death. After Rome became an empire, when they came in. Now, it would certainly explain why he was so neat and manicured if he was a druid and not a peasant. But ultimately, we don't really know. It's all just theory and speculation, and that's the beauty of Pete Marsh, who, again, you can still see at the British Museum. He's in the Iron Age exhibit. His story invites arguments and theories and debate, which to me are essential parts of doing history. And perhaps with our rapidly changing technology, one day we will find out for sure what happened, or at least uncover some more clues. But Pete Marsh's legacy goes beyond this really narrow window into the world of Iron Age Britons at the turn of the century. Jody Joy, who spent time as the curator of the Iron Age exhibit at the British Museum, wrote an article with fellow Iron Age curator Julia Farley that notes, quote, "Immediately following Lindow Man's recovery, he became the subject of a comprehensive scientific investigation, during which new approaches for studying and conserving bog bodies were developed. News of the discovery and investigation of Lindow Man were closely followed by the public through numerous press stories and documentaries." End quote. Pete Marsh's discovery led to advancements in the field of archaeology, particularly with British bog bodies, but more generically and generally concerning preserved human remains. He's iconic. He's the most well-preserved British bog body of the 8 currently on record, and he also spawned debates about the objectification of human remains in museum exhibits, which is an interesting moral question in itself. So let me know in the comments what you think about the Lindow Man or anything else I mentioned today. My name is Kelly Beard, and thank you for listening to this APHOUT mini on the Lindow Man. If you've enjoyed this episode, go check out some of my other minis or my longer podcast episodes, which drop every other Sunday. And make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any more bloody, gross, mysterious, or weird stories from history.